All right. So I think I'd like to continue the conversation that Michael Sandel started this morning. How many of you were here for the Sandel talk? Okay, all right. So, when he was at Oxford, his tutor had recommended to him that he read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And what I'm going to suggest today is that if I had been his tutor, I was actually a student, so it's kind of an interesting hypothetical. If I had been his tutor, I would have recommended that he read Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. And the reason is this, and what I'm going to propose today is a marriage of political economy and a genealogy of morals. But the reason, or the steps that would get us from Sandel's talk this morning to this paper would go as follows, or would sound something like the following. The illustrations that Sandel gave, really all of them, the most powerful illustrations were the ones that involved situations where the pie is enlarged as a result of the marketization of the commodity, right? So his first example of the refugees, a kind of a cap and trade on refugees, right? I mean, it's only compelling if we get to a situation where more refugees would be accepted overall, right? If the pie is enlarged, if there's an efficiency gain. That's true too for the other examples that he gave. And it's hard to make an argument about the value of a moral principle or of a vision of the good or of a particular a view about the virtues or values of parenting, for instance, in the baby cat case, or the virtues of kind of altruism in the case of refugees, if in fact it's at the expense of human life, right? If the pie shrinks, it's easy to argue for the virtue of or the value of altruism. But if the pie actually increases, if there are more people, if there are more refugees who will be accepted, and so more lives will be saved, it's hard for Sandel to argue that in fact there's a certain value that is being lost or a certain good that's being lost. And so you have to actually believe that, the values of parenting are a good in themselves to offset the loss of life that would be associated with, say, the non-marketization, in that particular case, of babies or refugees, right? And I think that once you if you take the economic perspective of efficiency with distributions afterwards, we don't deal with distributions with what the Chicago School would say, right? It's like we increase the pie, you deal with distributions, right? Then it's hard for a Kantian, I think, to argue that there is some value to a notion of parenting or refugees that is worth the cost of actual lives. That would be the direction, though, that one would need to go if one were trying to bring together economics and moral theory from that perspective. What I think is more realistic and less hypothetical is the fact that morals and morality and notions of morality have played an enormous role in producing the kind of truths about markets that we believe today. And so the issue of kind of dealing with morality is not so much one of finding a clean solution to the problem of efficiency, but rather to see how, in fact, moral notions have led us to the place where we are today. And to understand kind of the way in which these genealogies of morals have inflected neoliberalism and our belief today in the possibility and the value of the free market or of market mechanisms. And so what I'm going to try and do today is to explore the type of moralizations of political economic systems, of modes of production, of crime and deviance, of the rules and of rule breaking that are necessary and integral to getting oneself and others to accept or tolerate new styles of political economy, new ideological and material forms, and the security apparatuses that would accompany modern political, economic, market-related approaches. Now, as I tried to demonstrate in my previous research in The Illusion of Free Markets, the emergence of liberal economic ideas in the 18th century was inextricably linked to the idea of a strong police state. In The Illusion of Free Markets, I tried to document simultaneously, first, the diachronic evolution of two historical ideas, that of the free market on the one hand, so that's on the left-hand side, the left column, the diachronic evolution of notions of the free market, and on the right column, of notions of a police state, or the importance of policing. But then also, synchronically, to link how each of the historical stages of these two ideas relate to each other. So my research explores, on the one hand, how the concept of the free market emerged from 18th century notions of natural order, tracing the transformations and variations from an early divine notion of orderliness, which was tied to an idea of natural law. This, of course, in the work of the physiocrats, François Quesnay, and the first economists, through Jeremy Bentham, whose economics admittedly are complicated and messy, but nevertheless, I think, with elaboration, can be boiled down to the notion that the government should be quiet in economic affairs unless there are express reasons to intervene. Through the more secular ideas of self-interest, expertise, and informational advantage reflected in the more conventional 19th century theories of laissez-faire, and then to the cybernetic notions of spontaneous order elaborated by Friedrich Hayek, and by the more scientific and technical economic theories of the Chicago School of Economics about the efficiency of competitive markets. Now, on the other hand, I also tried to demonstrate how these varying notions of economic orderliness have been linked since their inception and at each stage with a paradoxical trust in government competence when it comes to policing and punishing. And this latter concept of the policed state, like the idea of the free market, evolved over time from early, what seemed today as simplistic, right? Natural order, a divine notion of natural order in the physiocrats seems today, of course, absurd and simplistic. So does the early notion, though, that was tied to it of legal despotism, of a form of legal despotism. That was the term, actually, that Quesnay used, un despotisme légal. And that was the notion, essentially, that you didn't need a legislature, in Quesnay's thought, in his writings. In fact, you only need a monarch, an absolute hereditary monarch. You don't need a legislature because natural order expresses itself through the monarch, except for one thing. And Quesnay explicitly accepted one thing for positive law, and that was penal law, criminal enforcement, right? And that was his concept of legal despotism. And it was expressed very nicely in the policing practices of the physiocrat Le Mercier de la Rivière, who was one of the only physiocrats who actually had a real administrative position. He was the intendant of Martinique. And one of the few things that he left at the island of Martinique was a police force. Now, and what I try to do is to trace also diachronically how these notions of legal despotism change over time, right? And change over time, but are always linked to the changing notion of natural orderliness. And so we see this, for instance, in Bentham's writings. Remember that Bentham called the penal code a grand menu of prices, right? And of course, he invented, or at least was deeply invested, in the panopticon prison, which is the most intensely surveilled space that one could have. This also kind of translates into the more conventional notion of the state as a night watchman in classical 19th century laissez-faire. To a certain extent, the metaphor had never really struck me until I kind of thought of these transitions. The metaphor of the state as night watchman, of course, as the police, or in its policing function. And then ultimately to the symbiotic function of the criminal law in Chicago school theory. Symbiotic, that is, to effective competitive markets. So if you read, for instance, Richard Posner's kind of articulation of what the criminal law, what the function of the criminal law is in a market economy, it's pretty clear. The major function of criminal law in a capitalist society is to prevent people from bypassing the system of voluntary compensated exchange, the market, explicit or implicit, in situations where, because transaction costs are low, the market is a more efficient method of allocating resources than forced exchange. In other words, Richard Posner would define crime as inefficient behavior in 1985, and essentially as market bypassing. So the market and the penal sphere are deeply imbricated for the Chicago school. The police function essentially serves as the outer bounds of the free market, as what it is that keeps us in this space that is to be unregulated. Now, throughout, I demonstrate the paradoxical linkage of the notion of orderliness in economics with the need for a big brother state when it comes to policing and punishing. In contrast to others who also study what has been called neoliberal penality today, this paradox of a supposedly hands-off government and of massive prison apparatus, I argue that the symbiotic relationship preceded the 1970s and was inscribed in early liberal thought. And in this sense, I resist Loïc Wacon's suggestion that, as he says, the expansive penal state is the distinct creation of neoliberalism and not an inheritance from or resurgence of classical liberalism. I trace our present conundrum in terms of mass incarceration, or the United States having essentially the greatest number and the greatest rate of prisoners in the world. I trace it back, further back, and I argue in essence that this paradoxical set of beliefs, on the one hand, in the incompetence of government in the economic domain, and on the other hand, in the legitimacy of government in the penal sphere, not only facilitated the exponential growth of prisons in America with mass incarceration in the 21st century, but also facilitated the birth of the penitentiary during the market revolution in the Jacksonian era. So the two periods where, and these are, this is a graph of our prison population in the United States, the two places where, on the one hand, the penitentiary was born in the early 19th century, and where the penitentiary has exploded at the end of the 20th century, are the two periods that were marked in American history by the most firm belief in the free market. Right? The first period being called the Market Revolution, the Jacksonian era, and of course the last 40 years being a period that some call neoliberalism, but that reflects this belief in free markets. Now, an undercurrent to that work, and perhaps it was an undercurrent that was not, that was too far under the surface, and it's what I'd like to think about today, has to do with the mechanisms and devices by which these ideas, so the idea of natural order or the idea of a free market, how those ideas become so pervasive and held as truth, how it is that we accept them, right? And my concern throughout is with the production of these truths. And one vital dimension is precisely the issue of moral economies, of the moralization of social relations and behaviors. The place to start in this kind of work, though this may be a bit surprising, but I think it's right, is with the English historian E.P. Thompson, whose work on the moral economies of the English crowd in the 18th century, or more generally on the notion of moral economies, would make us rethink seemingly spontaneous and spasmodic food riots as fully coherent moral resistance to new forms of economic exchange and new ideologies in economics. Now, Thompson helps us realize the extent to which the resistance was itself, the resistance of the mob, was itself grounded in notions of moral fault, of moral responsibility, of blame, of right and wrong, of good and evil. These were not, he argued, mere spasmodic responses to shortages and hunger. They represented a righteous indignation, a moralistic and political response to the shift away from paternalist rationality of customs. Now, I said it might be surprising because, of course, Thompson was using moralization and justifying resistance, whereas our task, in terms of our genealogy of morals, would be to show how the new political economies became acceptable and became tolerated, right? How these beliefs become acceptable and true, which is the flip, in some sense, of Thompson's work. Thompson is moralizing the resistance, and I think what we need to do is to moralize or understand the moral dimension of the acceptance of these ideas. Now, this is where, for instance, Max Weber would be helpful, at least the Nietzschean Weber, the Weber of the Protestant ethic, where, of course, we understand how the spirit of capitalism becomes so natural to us, like a well-worn glove, because it had been, for many, and for so long, a calling, as Weber would argue. The ascetic, rationalistic lifestyle, a calling for the Puritans, would become secondhand to us, right? Through a process through a genealogical process. And so we could try to excavate this Nietzschean Weber to show us the extent to which people are prepared morally or ethically for capitalism. The soil had to be tilled. It did not bear the fruit of markets spontaneously. So we have then, on the one hand, Thompson on the moral economies of resistance, and a Nietzschean Weber on the moral economies of acceptance. Now, Foucault would marry the two in his Collège de France lectures in The Punitive Society in the winter of 1973. And what he would do would be to graft a genealogy of morals on a political economy of what he called illégalisme, illegalisms, which I would argue we should use a neologism for this, often translated as illegalities, but to a certain extent the idea of illegalities already accepts the end state, which is that something has been rendered illegal, when in fact it's more like illegalisms. The idea of illegalisms is that the law itself is a constant struggle, a negotiation, an agonistic combat, a competition over the very question of defining the line of illegality, right? The line that divides deviations, disorderliness, and rule breaking from the illegal, from the sanction, Now, Foucault elaborated in 1973 a political economy based on this notion of illegalisms, a theory in 3 steps, and I'll give them to you very quickly. Foucault's first step starts with the idea that illegalisms are widespread throughout the 18th century and well distributed across the different class strata of society. The different strata practice strategic games at the borders and interstices of the law. And everyone is, in some sense, trying to push the limits of the law in the different classes, the popular classes, the merchant classes, etc. Second, then, Foucault identifies a break towards the end of the Ancien Régime, and he argues that as the 19th century approached, the popular illegalisms began to be perceived as a threat, a danger by the merchants and aristocrats, and what he refers to as the bourgeois in France, also in England, in Russia, etc. And the new forms of wealth accumulation, of movable goods, of stocks and supplies, as opposed to landed wealth, exposed massive amounts of chattel property to the workers who came in direct contact with commercial wealth. And the accumulation of wealth began to make popular illegalisms, the illegalisms of the popular class, less useful, even dangerous to the interests of the merchants. Foucault then identifies a third moment, a turn to the penal sanction. In the late 18th century, the commercial class seized the arm of criminal justice to put an end to these popular illegalisms, not only their depredation of material property, but also their dissipation of their own time and bodies, right? Because they had become, the popular class had become human capital. They had become property. Their labor had become property. And insofar as they were dissipating that through absenteeism, delay, laziness, parties, debauchery, nomadism, right? They were stealing the property of the merchants and of the owners. Now, so far we're still at the level of an explanation on the basis of political economy, which we should be used to, and notions of transformations of wealth that we're used to in the economic field. What he adds at this moment, though, is a genealogy of morals. And it's here, and it's only through the moralization, he argues, only through the moralization of those acts of debauchery, of absenteeism, that the managerial class would be able to transform formerly tolerated behaviors, even encouraged behaviors, into illegal acts. Okay? And Foucault would excavate and find this move in the writings of the Quakers and other dissenters, locating a moralized discourse that would introduce the idea of the penitentiary, of penitence, into the sphere of punishment. This passage, let me just translate it. This is from a text by a jurist reformer during the Napoleonic era regarding revisions to the penal code, a brutal text referring to the popular class as the bastardized race, right? In other words, in order to make it possible to transform popular behaviors into illegal acts, it required a moralization of those particular behaviors. Here, this is from this text from the beginning of the 19th century. Here, hard souls, dry, wild, devoid of moral ideas, will only obey their gross sensations. Laziness, immorality, greed, envy will prove to be the irreconcilable enemy of wisdom and labor, of economy and property, right? This is, it refers, the bastardized, degenerate race, which were the popular classes, right? Same thing in this passage from the kind of rural peasantry, right? The peasant is a wicked, cunning, ferocious beast, half civilized. He has no heart, no integrity, no honor. He often lets himself be led by ferocity. And so Foucault actually engages in this, this dialogue, a fictitious dialogue between the popular class and the bourgeoisie, the merchant class. And he has the working class ask the bourgeoisie, why? What has changed? Why this change? Didn't we together violate the law, circumvent the rules, right? Didn't we, under the Ancien Régime, You circumvent the monarch, and us circumvent you, together, working together as a way around all of these oppressive rules. To which the bourgeois responds, yes, but under the Ancien Régime, we were all together fighting power, unjustifiable abuses of the monarch. We were taking on sovereign power. It was political. But now you are just attacking private property. Formerly, we fought together against abuse of power. Now you are violating the law, and it manifests a complete lack of morals. And in his manuscript, which he apparently didn't say this, but at the end of this beautiful paragraph where he has this fictitious dialogue between the popular class and the merchants, where they telling the popular classes basically, look, this used to be political, right? We used to work together for political reasons. Now you guys are just a bunch of immoral bastards, right? He says, allez, et faites pénitence, right? Go, do your penitence, right? And it's that notion, that genealogical notion of morality, that way in which morality is kind of inserted into these belief systems. It's at that moment, really, that we see in Foucault's work this idea of the birth of the penitentiary in the beginning of the 19th century as a way to deal with changing economic systems and changing economic beliefs, right? This is the moment where Foucault would turn from the archaeological method. I would identify this moment in 1973 as the moment where he moves from archaeology to genealogy, and where you see this, the birth of kind of a notion of penitence and of the penitentiary as being important kind of to moralize economic beliefs. 5 minutes. I'll try and wrap it up.
Are we 5 minutes over by now?
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay. All right. So what I'll suggest very quickly is that you can trace all of these moralizing tendencies through the different historical steps that brought us from natural order to notions of laissez-faire, to notions of Chicago school economics, right? And each one of them, we would be able to kind of extricate the moral ideas that are there, and the way in which a turn to moralization is necessary to make palatable or acceptable the new truths about markets, etc. So let me just, this is, you can see, for instance, you can read it, for instance, in Richard Posner's personal views about the need to hate the criminal, right? A very moralistic notion of the importance of actually, for society, of hating the criminal. A notion that comes from James Fitzjames Stevens, but that Posner argues still should apply today. This is a little tidbit from his idea here that basically, a bare bones system for the defense of indigent criminal defense may ultimately be optimal, right? And it may be optimal because, the probability of convicting an innocent person is pretty low, and so we should be able to get through it. Gary Becker, I'm very fond of, terribly sad he passed away, in a debate we had, was talking about the notions of human capital, and finally when he gets to it, you really get a sense that, you get a sense that there is this notion of individual responsibility that is nevertheless embedded in the idea of human capital, right? And what we're pointing out to them is young African-American men here, trying to understand the consequences. But there's this kind of idea that what we are trying to do is point out to them something about unemployment. Okay. So, and of course, we see this throughout, for instance, well, Nixon for sure, DeLulio, of course, in all of the super predator talk, right? This was the epitome, in some sense, of the moralizations that were necessary, on the one hand, to get the police state going and for it to go with the free market. Actually, Nixon's is particularly interesting because you see right here the complete imbrication of a notion of laissez-faire, free market economics, moralized against a notion of government policing. Again, moralized notion. So, well, we can talk about that. In any event, the point I'm trying to make is that what is often missing but motivating and driving these transformations and producing the kind of consensus that is necessary in order to accept what are often dubious principles, but to make them truthful to us, are forms of moralization that are deeply embedded in the discourse that surrounds both the economics and the policing.